Uh, so welcome everybody. I'm Sean Randolph, Senior Director at the Bay Area Council's Economic Institute. We're the research and strategy arm for the council, and I'm pleased to welcome you aboard the Klamath, our 100-year-old ferry boat that serves as the council's headquarters and also increasingly as a convening space for people and ideas about the future of our economy here in the region, but also in the state, nationally and globally as well. So we're here to talk about AI. It's not a new topic, but it's fast moving, and there are enormous consequences for us here in the Bay Area. I think, as everybody knows, the world's largest and most significant AI companies are headquartered here locally. 50% of the world's top AI companies are here in the Bay Area, many of which you could walk to within 15 or 20 minutes of where we are right now. 9 of the top 10 venture deals in the region last year were for AI companies. This region has more AI talent measured by job postings than the next 13 metropolitan regions in the United States put together. And San Francisco downtown, as you all know, has been pretty quiet the last few years. A lot of that empty commercial office space is filling up, guess what, with AI companies, some taking 500, 800,000 square feet at a time, but 70, 80 or more smaller venture-funded AI companies shopping around for 15 to 40, 50, 60,000 square feet of space. So how this evolves is highly consequential globally, but it's especially consequential for us here in the region, given our national and global leadership on this issue. A lot of the forums we've hosted, and I think many of us have been to, have focused understandably on the policy debates in Sacramento. What's California regulatory policy going to be? What's the view of the administration in Sacramento and the legislature? And we'll talk about that some today, but that's not our focus, really. That's part of it, but we're looking at something different now. We're looking at the global context that California is part of, but we're one part of a much larger discussion at the national level, at the global level, among many different countries, sometimes together, sometimes individually, about the regulatory framework and how do you optimally balance innovation with appropriate and necessary regulation. So we're here today in part to understand what that global landscape looks like, understanding that it's moving fast, it's fast changing, and if we gather 6 months from now, we may have a different narrative. But I think that's why we're all here today. In the global context, one of the goals from the standpoint of the Council is that we're very actively involved in APEC, the Asia Pacific Intergovernmental Organization. When APEC met in San Francisco here in November a year ago, we hosted 17 events here aboard the Klamath side events. We had a presence in the APEC summit in Lima, Peru last November, and we're committed to being at the next 5 APEC meetings at the least. And we know the global interest in what happens here in California around AI. And so our plan is to organize a substantial forum, bringing the expertise and perspective from California and the Bay Area, Silicon Valley, into those important conversations at APEC. So we hope that will have a role with California at the table in shaping some of those policies. And today we have a phenomenal set of speakers. You couldn't have more expertise in the room on these topics. So to set the stage for the conversation, we'll have our leadoff speaker, and then we'll have a terrific panel. But we're very honored to have with us Janet Napolitano, former U.S. Secretary of Homeland Security, former governor of Arizona, past president of the University of California, and today director of the Center for Security and Politics at UC Berkeley. Secretary Napolitano has been at the forefront of both national and global security issues for many years. Her leadership and public policy at many different levels gives her, I think, a unique perspective on the topic we have today, both the challenges and opportunities that AI presents in a national and global context. So please join me in welcoming Secretary Napolitano.
Well, good morning, everybody. Who here has been to an AI conference in the last 3 months? How many have been to more than one? Yeah, it is the topic du jour. It's the topic of the era because it is a new era. And it's exciting. It's important, it's exciting, it's substantive, and it is complicated. I want to thank the Bay Area Council for inviting me to be with you today, and my former student and now friend, Rachael Robinson, who facilitated the invite. And I thought what I would do with my opening remarks is try to set the stage. What are the uncertainties surrounding AI? How do potential regulators look at those uncertainties? And then what are the institutions that already exist, that are already trying to intervene, trying to get something out, the EU, the G7, Japan, etc., the UN. But what are some of the fundamental questions that we need to really address as we move into this AI era? And I think we have to begin with the notion that, and I'm speaking as a former regulator, I'm not an AI engineer, obviously, but from a regulator's standpoint, a policymaker's standpoint, there is what is known as an evidence dilemma. An evidence dilemma. In other words, we're asking regulators to weigh risks and benefits without a large body of scientific evidence. And the question is, do we have time to wait for that evidence to develop, or is regulation going to proceed as rapidly as people can think of ideas of what to regulate? But the evidence dilemma is real. And there are no common standards. There are no common standards for measuring how AI augments human capabilities. And experts disagree, whether capabilities will advance slowly, rapidly, extremely rapidly. Increased scale has largely driven recent developments. And then lastly, when you are a policymaker, when you're a regulator, one of the key thing you're looking at is risks. You're dealing with something new. What are the risks? And there are different kinds and categories of risks. There is the risk of a malicious actor who would misuse a foundational model to deliberately cause harm, child sexual abuse material, disinformation, two examples. There are non-malicious actors who use models as intended yet unintentionally cause harm, bias against certain groups, for example. And then there are systematic risks. The widespread deployment of foundation models, what does that mean? For labor market disruption, for environmental risks, for privacy risks, for copyright. So there are different kinds of risks, and depending on where the policymaker is and whatever governmental structure you're talking about, they are going to put those risks in different priority order. How do we ensure? Everybody wants a great and innovative AI system, ecosystem. And we know that AI applications have innumerable societal benefits. I was reading in the New York Times yesterday that there's a project called the Human Virome, which is looking at trillions of viruses that occupy our bodies. Who knew? And AI now is being turned to that, to map the human virome as opposed to the genome. AI has definitely changed warfare. It's definitely changed how we target, how we surveil, how we deploy. There is a new type of warfare in this century, and it is going to be driven by AI. And I think that's actually, in a way, a benefit from my perspective. When we think about AI in the international or global environment, we have to think about questions moving forward, questions that any country needs to ask itself, any group of countries, any state, any group of states. One is, should we focus on transparency? And how do we ensure or encourage transparency around companies' own internal risk assessments and research findings? Or is this a pipe dream? Is this a pipe dream? Are companies really going to voluntarily turn over what they are finding with their research? Is third-party risk assessment a viable option? If so, who? Is it required? Is it voluntary? When should it be done in the development process? All unanswered questions. How do we address trade-offs and costs? Transparency may reveal personal information or IP. It also can slow innovation, and it may not by itself ensure accountability. But we keep hearing transparency, transparency, transparency. I'd like to hear more from my fellow panelists about that. What about a system for adverse event reporting? You know, in the cybersecurity realm, we now have a system where critical infrastructure has to report adverse events to CISA at the Department of Homeland Security. But that system has basically been used for reporting of ransomware attacks, not the kinds of things I think we may see with AI. So, question, if we have a system for adverse event reporting, how to enforce it? Who do you report to? How is that report disseminated? Now, when we think about regulation of AI, we have to think about what level we're talking about. You have states, you have California, you have other states, all of whom are passing, many of whom are considering legislation this year. You have the federal government, and it is somewhat mysterious now to know what the new administration is going to do with AI. We know they rescinded the Biden EO, but we don't really know what they're going to do in its place, if anything, and who will do it and when it will be done. And will the federal government try to preempt the states? In other words, say that this is such an important area that we need national uniformity and independent state action will not be supported. How about internationally? We have the UK, we have the EU, we have the countries of Asia, we have the UN, all of whom have been taking action with respect to AI. Do we have a way to evaluate how those actions are actually working in practice? And what further actions are contemplated? Is there, and we talked a little bit about this in the pre-panel, here's a fundamental question. Is there any hope, expectation that we could have a global consensus on AI governance, at least with respect to issues like a glossary, a common vocabulary? Right now, we don't have one. Interoperability, that would also be a value. But different countries have different interests and are situated differently competitively. So is there a notion that this is such a thing that we could actually bring the nations of the world together? We all know the current administration is not a fan of multilateral agreements. So that also has to be factored in. In other words, what is the current political situation, not just in the United States, but internationally as well in our other countries? These are all fundamental questions. And I want to leave you with one last thought, which is that we need to move with urgency, but we need to move thoughtfully. We need to move with the idea that this is about mitigating risk, but it's also about facilitating benefit. And finally, since I'm here at the Bay Area Council, I have to say that the Bay Area definitely has the talent to be the center of the AI world. We should have an active talent recruitment and retention program. We should, I say as the former president of the University of California, be supporting our academic institutions to help supply that workforce pipeline. We have to keep an eye on what's happening internationally, federally, and in Sacramento. We need to support companies that use AI applications, expanding beyond the AI development itself. We need to keep branding ourselves in the AI world. But with that, I have not answered any of these questions, but they are all food for thought. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for setting the stage for us, Secretary Napolitano. So we're going to launch into our discussion of this intersection of AI policy, AI innovation, and global security. And as I said earlier, we have really a remarkable panel of super knowledgeable people about this. So as I read their names, I just invite you to come up and join us on the stage here. First, Dr. Alice Fields, the head of global AI policy and emerging technologies at Google, where she leads international policy development on AI safety, regulation, and innovation. So welcome, Alice. Rachael Kells, the Chief of Staff for the UK's Technology Envoy. So the Envoy plays a key role in shaping the UK's global innovation strategy with its strong connection here to us in the Bay Area and Silicon Valley. So Rachael, welcome. And Paula Goldman, Chief Ethical and Humane Use Officer and EVP for Product at Salesforce. And she leads the efforts of the company to ensure that AI is developed responsibly and ethically and at scale. So I will sit over here maybe. No, I'll just stand here. That way I can see you better. So we'll launch into it. First, this is just for the panel. Like anybody on the panel, Secretary Napolitano, would you like to come up here as well? Okay, great. We seem to have too many chairs. I think one of those is yours. So Secretary Napolitano framed this question of the global context and these different approaches. So this is really for anybody in the panel. There are some countries that have been distinctly leading. We have these global AI summits, UK, South Korea, France. You have these conversations about safety, innovation. So what's your perception of what companies or what countries are leading in this discussion? Which countries are kind of setting the tone and setting the pace for where the discussion may lead? Recognizing that we don't know where it's actually going to lead. So it's just an open question. We're going to come back to the UK very specifically soon, so don't worry about that, Rachael.
You want me to jump on that? First of all, I want to say thank you to our hosts for having us here on this in this unique venue. It's pretty exciting to be in a little piece of California history and San Francisco history on the Klamath. My name is Alice Friend. I'm the head of AI and emerging tech policy at Google. And I have a global remit. It is my job to think about exactly that question all the time. Where are we seeing sort of the healthiest approaches to AI policy and regulation around the world that's really balancing innovation and safety and security in a really positive way for consumers, for global publics, for businesses, right? I think that's the main question before us today. Secretary Napolitano's speech was a fantastic framing of all the issues, and I think the major trade-offs that we all face in this space. Particularly thinking about, what did you call it? I hadn't heard that before, the evidence gap or the evidence. Such an excellent point, because that's what we're all struggling with. This is early days of this technology being usable, right? It's been an area of research for decades. We at Google have been working on it for more than a decade, but we're just now getting consumer products. We're getting to the point where we're talking about, what does adoption look like? What are the patterns of use? What are the different use cases? And what we're all learning together is this is a general purpose technology. It is being integrated into almost every sector you can think of. And that makes the regulatory conversation and the public policy conversation so much more complicated, because we're not just talking about healthcare or just talking about transportation or just talking about national security. We're talking about all of it at once. It's, my boss at work calls it everything everywhere all at once. But you know, it's a little film, a little indie film. So, you know, when we look around the world at sort of the positive examples, you know, we do look at the UK. I think the UK has been very thoughtful about this across governments. Japan, I know we have some Japanese colleagues in the audience today. Japan also has been incredibly thoughtful and careful, has both led their own domestic process, but also globally through the G7 Hiroshima process, to think through sort of what's the principled approach here, and then how do we derive from those principles healthy approaches in each sector, right? You know, in the US, I think it's been very tumultuous, to say the least, but at the same time, we've seen a lot of consistency across administrations really for the last 10 years about figuring out, how do we encourage research and development? How do we build on the incredible economic engine that is innovation in the United States? But how do we do that in a responsible way that will take care of publics, right? And I think what we're seeing now is that the new administration has given itself 6 months to study this issue and think about how it wants to approach it as well. I think it's very healthy, actually. They didn't come in, you know, sure of what the answer was. They're actually going through this process of accepting sort of comments from the public. There's an RFI process right now. So I think there's sort of a lot of places around the world where nobody's letting themselves panic, and they're not rushing to a conclusion. They recognize that this is an evolving space, that we're still building the science and the evidence, and that we need to think through all the complexities and go from there. So I think there's actually a lot of bright spots out in the world.
Please.
Working, yes. First of all, thank you for having me. I'm Paula. I lead the Office of Ethical and Humane at Salesforce, and I am deep in the product and translating what does responsible use look like when we put product out in the world to companies. I will say this is the first panel that I've had Superwoman, motion sickness, air bans for. I love it. So a couple of points to add. I think it was an excellent commentary and summary, and I loved your opening remarks as well. I think I want to add, you know, like thinking about, for example, the EU AI Act and your point about general purpose technology and the sort of everything everywhere all at once. It's also really important, and Salesforce has been advocating for many, many years for this, to take a risk-based approach to this technology. And that's, I think, one of the things that we really appreciate about, and it's not just the EU, it's many different countries that are rising to that approach and saying, okay, what's actually really most important is maybe not necessarily the general technology, but its application, and that we focus on the areas that have the most impact on people's lives. For example, AI in recruiting, or AI to judge who gets a loan, or so on, right? And give specific rules that then also get distinguished between the developer of the technology, the deployer of the technology, and so on. And I think we see some growing consensus around that. There's more work to do. one of the things we talked about in the pre-session was this question of standards. And I can say, because I have the luxury or the privilege of talking to companies, enterprises every day that are adopting AI, they all really want to do the right thing in this case, right? And it's in their self-interest to do the right thing. They don't want to embarrass themselves with their customers. They want accurate results from AI. But we're not speaking the same language collectively about what that means. And so to be able to define what does it mean? What does accuracy mean for AI agents? What does bias mean for a particular sector, and so on? That's, I think, where this question of interoperability and international standards comes. The other thing I'd say too is that there is a huge amount, as you all know, of regulatory activity going on, even including in the United States, thinking about state by state. There's a ton of it. It is deeply important that we end up with a situation where these things are interoperable, and not just within the United States, but globally. It's very important for adoption for companies. But I also take it as sort of encouraging that there is so much activity, that people are paying attention, and that the questions, we're not waiting, as you were saying, this kind of evidence question, we're not waiting to ask the questions. And that's really healthy that we're having these conversations at so much volume.
Please, Rachel.
Thanks all, and thanks for having me and being on the panel today. So yeah, just to add to that, from kind of a UK perspective, my panelists have been very kind in terms of recognizing the UK, but I think the other point I will build on that Paula was saying, but also Secretary Napolitano, was just about the international coordination and engagement that there is. And I can see lots of consular colleagues in the room, but actually there is a lot of international debate, whether that be at G7, UN, about how we bring together, and it's almost back to your challenge, Secretary Napolitano, about how we work together and whether there is that possibility of kind of a global standard. But I think regardless of whether there is or not, there is certainly a lot of international collaboration on that. So yeah, nice to hear the UK name checked, but obviously, there's a lot of international work going on as part of this as well.
Thanks very much. Unless there's any more on this topic, we'll keep with the topic. So I think this may be for you, Alice or Paula, but really anybody. So how do these, let's say, competing or different regulatory frameworks sort of affect your ability as companies to innovate and deploy globally? Because if we look at the US context, I think last year, I forget the exact number, there were probably like 16 different bills in the California legislature that would have regulated AI in some respect, and some were signed by the governor, some weren't, and some didn't make it all the way through. But so in California, we're kind of a poster child for the enthusiasm for regulation, but at least a majority, a large number of other US states last year were doing exactly the same thing. So it has to be difficult from the standpoint of a company here. Like, how do we deal with a regulatory environment in the US where it varies state to state, and then you get globally with all these different kind of environments out there? So how does the current uncertainty or unsettled nature of the regulatory environment globally sort of affect your decision-making as companies? And I'd be especially interested that the term interoperability was really interesting. So what might interoperability look like?
Sure. So there are a couple of questions in there. So first, maybe the question about how does the sort of this nascent stage of regulation and kind of potential divergences, how does that impact how we operate? I will say Salesforce has been similar to Google, has been working on AI for 10 years. Trust has been our #1 value from the start. And to begin with, especially this year as we're surging on agentic AI, and there aren't even, you think about that for a second, right? So AI agents, AI that takes action on your behalf, not just makes recommendations. A lot of the regulation was written, a lot of the regulation that is enforced was written before that was really even considered or contemplated. So the number one principle is we attempt to not only do the right thing, but to lean in and to try to make sense of, okay, here's the spirit of, let's say, a risk-based approach. So in these different categories of risk, how would we translate that to what we think best practice is? And then sort of engage with stakeholders, including not just our customers, but obviously regulators from around the world, and try to make sense and say, you know, this is something we were discussing. A lot of times laws are passed and they leave a lot of room for interpretation, right? So the way that we try to deal with that uncertainty is by asserting what best practice looks like, to try to put it out there, to engage in these sort of multi-stakeholder dialogues. So for example, we recently joined an effort with governments and nonprofit sector from around the world called Current AI. It was launched at the Paris AI Action Summit, and it was all about public benefit AI. And it was similar to that. It was like, how could you create these sort of public, transparent, open source data sets and standards? And that is why, because if we're not speaking the same language about the same problem we're trying to solve, we're in trouble. But because there is ambiguity, it provides an opportunity for leadership.
I think that's all exactly right. And, you know, the pragmatic answer to how hard is fragmentation in the regulatory environment on companies, the answer is it's hard on us, it's hard on consumers, and it's hard on the markets where we're deploying really differentiated products, right? So, you know, one of the claims, we'll see if it's true, right? One of the claims about what's going on in the EU is that the products that Europeans are going to get won't be as good as they might be elsewhere, in part because of all the regulatory hurdles that are in Europe, or they may get the same thing, but they get it 6 months later than the rest of the world, right? And so it's sort of over to policymakers to consider, you know, whether or not that's of value to them and what that means in their markets, right? I think, you know, when it comes to how do we make an interoperable sort of global regime on AI regulation, on AI policymaking, you know, we began in a really good place where we talked about what are sort of the principles that globally everyone agrees on. And then what we have to do is figure out, you know, what are the details that underpin that. So the secretary talked about transparency standards, right? What are the transparency artifacts that can be used across markets, across different governments, that will in fact meet the objectives that global governments agree are all important, right? Because there's transparency that's useful to a user, there's transparency for safety, there's transparency for information that government needs. And then there are trade-offs in that space, right? There's trade-offs between transparency and privacy. There's trade-offs between full transparency and intellectual property. And so, you know, what we've done is introduce this concept of a model card sort of as a starter. We've been publishing our own AI progress reports for years, trying to establish a little bit of these are the kinds of things that's useful and productive to release. And I think, you know, 2025 is really the year the rubber's meeting the road on, you know, what do transparency mechanisms really look like and what is useful? And that's the missing center, is transparency to accomplish what, and what is the information that will actually accomplish those different public policy objectives? That's what we don't quite have fully built out yet.
And as a possible policymaker, regulator, my question is, how do I police companies that do not seek to abide by any transparency regime?
Standards and best practices for in the industry, right? I mean, Google's perspective has long been AI is too important not to regulate, right? So it's not that there should be no transparency requirements. It's that we have to be clear about what those transparency requirements are for, what will satisfy them. This is what we're struggling with in the EU right now, is that the GPI Code of Practice, which is supposed to be how you comply with the AI Act, right, is the drafts so far have asked for a level of detail that is concerning from a cybersecurity perspective, from an intellectual property perspective, and it is unclear what the connection is between that detail and public policy objectives at the same time. So, again, this is like a live conversation about what does good really look like here, and what can the industry get together and agree on with policymakers as setting the standard for how we ensure safe deployment of these systems.
And how does the industry factor in that? A company like Google has the resources to comply with a pretty extensive regulatory regime, but many small or medium-sized companies don't. So how do we factor that in?
Yeah. I actually think that the voice of business, particularly the voice of enterprises that are using AI, should be louder in this discussion, because they are, subject to, in particular circumstances, they'll be subject to some of these regulations for the use of AI. And they have, I think, they're one of the stakeholders. So we often think about like civil society as a key stakeholder, right? But businesses using AI have a huge amount of interest in having a uniform sort of set of standards, a clear way of transparency, so that they know what they're getting and they know what their part of the responsibility chain is. And that's one message that I just really want to impart. Particularly, I'm so grateful to the council for hosting this conversation. And I think it's a clear role that the council can play here in these conversations to elevate that voice. And your question was about, can you repeat it?
Yeah, I was pointing out that if you have an extensive regulatory regime, a very detailed one, a big company has the resources to comply, but a smaller, medium-sized company may not. How do we factor that in?
No, and I think that's right. And I think that's why, like, really focusing on sort of the most important things and taking a risk-based approach to it is really important. Like, so for example, going back to your point about adverse event reporting. One trend that I've noticed from a regulatory perspective has been that we focus on AI as a sort of horizontal general purpose thing. But if you think about something like adverse event reporting, this was a subject that we sort of delved into. I'm a member of the National AI Advisory Committee, and we sort of looked at this question. And one of the key strategy issues from a regulatory perspective is, do you want just any kind of adverse event reporting, or do you want it sector by sector? And would you want various agencies to oversee it rather than kind of a universal view? And I think that's actually part of the answer to your question, is that we want to be careful about the extent to which we're only focusing on sort of AI models, which has been a huge thrust of some of the recent regulatory conversations, versus looking at the systems and classifying them by risk. And I think that approach is more friendly to some of the smaller businesses that are creating AI, as well as the businesses that are using AI.
Maybe just a follow-up question. Sort of different, different governments have different starting points, different philosophical approaches or principles. So what would you say is the quality of your interaction with different governments? Generally speaking, whether it's the AI or France or Germany or Italy or India, wherever, how receptive and open are they to your ideas and your input as leading companies in the field? Would you say it's an open dialogue, or are some conversations easier than others?
One of the real privileges of working on AI, I think, I don't know if you find this to be true too, is that, we are all sincerely trying to figure out the best approach here. And so in all of my engagements with governments all over the world and with representatives here in San Francisco, there's always a really constructive approach to it. And, I also have the great privilege of being able to sort of bring in colleagues from Google DeepMind and Google Research and like really geek out, talk about the technologies here. And I just find that there's a lot of just interest in learning and interest in dialogue. And it's not that they don't ever ask us tough questions or make, like we have a lot of closed door conversations where we really get into it, but it's always constructive. And that to me is really exciting and heartening and makes it fun to do this job every day, honestly.
I agree. And this is what I was saying earlier, which is that, there's a lot of activity. We ultimately want to see convergence to the extent that that's possible. But it's all everyone's trying to do the right thing, to get it right, to take advantage of this opportunity, right? And so in that sense, I think there's a lot of openness and appropriately a lot of opportunity for cross stakeholder communication, so that companies obviously have a voice, but you want civil society at the table, you want multilateral all that kind of stuff. And I see a lot of that, and it's encouraging.
Thanks. So Rachel, we're going to
wait a minute. I got wait. This sounds like a very ideal world to me. This is not the world that I have experienced. So can you look, you go into a country, everybody's, peaches and butterflies, but really? You're not having any hard conversations in any country about regulation versus innovation and who regulates and who pays for it, et cetera?
Of course, we're having hard conversations, but I will say I have a national security background. And again, but by the time I got to a national security career, there were decades and decades and decades of precedent, and sort of we all knew what we were talking about, and there were like set institutions and rules for how we did it, and everybody sort of knew their answers already. And I think what's so important about AI is, again, we're at the cusp of this, we're at the start, and so we really sincerely are in a place where everybody around the table, no matter what community you're from, even if you come into the room with some preset concepts of who you're going to be talking to based on where they're coming from, very rapidly you get to the point where you're talking real shop and you're really trying to fix it. And anybody who's like not coming from that perspective very quickly just finds themselves not in the center of the conversation, because it's too important, right? It's too important for us to sort of let it bog down in acrimony and humans being humans, right? So I'm not going to say that we don't have tough conversations or there's like serious differences of opinion out there. But again, it really is, to me, has been very pleasantly surprising how constructive we were just both in Paris, right? I don't know if we were all there, but it felt like the whole AI world converged, and everyone is just trying to get it right. And I think that was sort of the tone of the whole thing. And you can have taken away sort of different interpretations of it there, but if you're talking about the interactions of the people, like constructive is the word that always comes to mind.
So Rachel, we're going to come to the UK then. Prime Minister Starmer's declared his intent to unleash AI. He's announced recently big investments in AI infrastructure in the UK, indicated pretty early on that the UK might be choosing its own course vis-a-vis what's happening in continental Europe. So what can you share about the direction that policy is taking in the UK, maybe how it's differentiated or distinctive from perhaps alternative ways of looking at it, and what are the expectations? Obviously, the Prime Minister feels this could have a bigger transformative effect on the UK.
Yeah, so I think you're referring to the Prime Minister's AI Opportunities Action Plan that he announced back in January. And that really set the scene for how he views AI and what he wants to do domestically on AI policy to make sure, that the UK is a place that AI companies can really feel at home, and how the UK's AI sector can scale and win globally. For me, it's really interesting to see how he views that delivering on his domestic priorities, so growth domestically, but also improving public services domestically. But also, I think he sees AI really at the forefront of international partnerships. So I know, kind of coming out of the press conference at the White House last week, he was talking about AI and how the UK and the US could work together on AI moonshots. So, you know, he clearly fundamentally sees AI at the heart of UK policy. The Opportunities Action Plan that was announced in January was really well received by kind of industry, companies headquartered in the UK and the US, and also domestically as well. But I think what came off the back of that was, well, what are you doing about regulation? And that was the kind of key question that we were that was thrown at us afterwards. And it's kind of completely understandable given the debate that's been going on here. So I think the UK's approach wants to be highly targeted. We want to learn the lessons from others that are kind of going forward with regulation. And again, as Alice was saying, you know, really wanting to bring all of those voices to the table as we develop our legislation. You know, the government's committed to legislating, but how do we bring that broad range of stakeholders, civil society, as you mentioned, companies, getting all those voices in so that we can come up with with legislation that can respond to such a fast evolving technology, and can mean that we're really able to benefit from the opportunities that AI brings, but in a safe manner. And I think when we've talked about some of the debate here, you know, I think a lot of people are grappling with that and coming out in slightly different places on it. But excuse me. But fundamentally, like that's what we're all looking for. We're looking to be able to use AI as safely as possible, but really getting the benefits out of it as well. And just how we all work together on that. So I think there is that kind of constructive and really wanting to bring in that those different voices and that dialogue, recognizing that we do have tough conversations, we do have scratchy moments, but it's that kind of approach that everyone's bringing to the table.
Thank you. So this may be another one for you, Paula, but for anybody. So, you know, here in the Bay Area, we are sort of innovation central when it comes to AI. So what kind of difference does it make being a Bay Area / Silicon Valley company? Is there a particular approach or a particular set of values that come with that? Because I'm thinking ahead, when we take whatever we bring to APEC next November, we want to bring sort of a Bay Area, Silicon Valley perspective. Everybody always wants to know what's going on here, what people are thinking around tech. Is there anything here that especially informs how you approach these questions?
Well, I'm sure, I'm guessing everyone in the room is local or spends a lot of time here. And I'm sure we share the experience of the news of innovation being overwhelming, right? And we're in the epicenter of it, right? So every day, if all you did was follow research releases and new product reports and so on, you could spend all day on it and still not be up to speed, right? I think that's the perspective of sitting in the middle of that, and also having a firm sense of wanting to leverage that innovation for public benefit, for innovation, for competitiveness. It's that perspective that you want to bring. And what I will say too is the voice of Bay Area business on this, right? There's probably no geography where you know, you can't drive on the freeway without seeing some sort of billboard about AI, right? Every single executive in the Bay Area, I'm guarantee, has that top of mind. And this goes back to my point about bringing the voice, not just the Salesforces and the Googles of the world, but all types of enterprises in the Bay Area that are figuring out how to bring AI to life in their business and how to transform their businesses with it. And what are the common sense regulations that they need? I would really like to see that voice louder.
Any other thoughts on that one?
Also, a quick plug for the universities here in the Bay Area. That's an enormous boon for, I think, everybody in the Bay, whether you're coming from business, whether you are a student, whether you are a researcher, you know, I know we have colleagues from the Berkeley Risk and Security Lab here as well that rolls up under the secretary. You know, we do a lot of work with Stanford as well. Just there is a critical mass of brilliant people working, particularly in AI, but on tech in general here, attracted here over the years, and they choose to stay, right? And so I think part of the key to the specialness of this place is sort of we choose over and over and over again to be that place that attracts those minds and attracts those people. And so that's the key to me. I grew up here and I left 25 years ago and I came back a couple years ago for this role. I'm so happy to be home. There's nowhere else like it. And so I do hope we just continue to keep in mind what makes us special and why we're the innovation hub really of the world.
Amen, sister.
Secretary Napolitano, so back in this theme then of global collaboration, you know, we've seen the summits in the UK and South Korea, in France. We know all these conversations are going on. Any thoughts on how we can collectively, here from the Bay Area, of course, sort of foster and encourage this kind of global collaboration to the point where we do have this kind of interoperability? And is there a particular role you would see international organizations or institutions like APEC or others playing in that process? I'd say APEC and the UN.
Yeah, it's a difficult question because there's so many players, all well-intentioned, and so much activity going on, and yet we're still at the very beginning, right? It is hard to say, well, the UN should do this, or this should be the G7, or something of that ilk, because when you designate, you're inclusive but also exclusive. And in my view, what probably will happen is that as all these various summits are going on, there's going to be a common core of people who are in attendance, and any sort of activity to devise a common glossary or vocabulary, whatever, will rise and should rise organically from those people, as opposed to designating, well, this international institution or that international institution. I think that's the only way it would really work and be adopted within the AI community and the AI ecosystem, and also avoid being trapped into the geopolitical atmosphere that we have today.
Thanks very much. Let's come back to the US now. The guidance on AI that was in place under the last administration isn't operative now. We have sort of a pause now waiting for a kind of new guidance coming out of Washington. So just in principle, are there particular ideas or principles that you would find to be helpful and constructive in whatever that new guidance might be?
Well, I'll just speak for myself, but I mean, what the panelists have to say, but I suspect we'll get something ultimately that's shorter, and that is 90 to 95% substantively the same as what the Biden EO had.
Yeah, well, I think it's an important comment in the sense that there's been a lot of consistency from across administrations on these issues. And I was just like checking my dates, but I believe it was under the first Trump administration that the National AI Office was created, the National AI Advisory Board, et cetera. And there's been a bunch of through lines, right? There's been a through line about competitiveness. There's been a through line about workforce development. I know that's a priority. I hope it keeps becoming that we keep investing in it. There's a through line about supporting innovation. And I believe that there should be a through line about a risk-based approach to it. Again, that we're not just looking at general purpose AI systems, but we're looking at the ones that have the highest risk, and we're putting rules that are specific to those types of risks in place for those types of systems. That's what I would say. But I think we're early, and I'm optimistic about those through lines and that consistency.
one of the things we'd really like to see the administration take up is the question about energy supply and how we're going to modernize energy in the United States. And I think this is a problem that has been building for quite some time. But we recognize that data centers and powering, not just training AI, which gets a lot of attention, but the inference side of it, like the using of the models, takes energy. And so we need a really comprehensive approach to how are we going to invest more in energy infrastructure in this country. And from our perspective, we know that we have to come up with things that are additive to the grid, right? So we've been getting really creative along with others in industry about small modular nuclear reactors and so forth. But just, seeing the new administration really take that on as an issue, I think would be really constructive.
Great, thank you. And back to you, Secretary Napolitano, your center has published recently, it's been doing research on this question of whether models are the best way to focus in regulation and looking at the importance of quantifying certain things. So could you share with us the direction of the research coming out of your center on this topic?
Well, we have lots of different research products coming out of the center, but one of the questions the center's been asking is model weights. What about data integrity, and how do we protect that and ensure that? And you could kind of stack up the elements that go into an AI system, and in each one there is a question about regulation, not regulation, integrity, and then what's its importance within the whole system. So we've been looking at the whole queue, so to speak.
So if you want more detail, find the research.
Can I make a quick
Please do.
comment on that? So I think this is a really key area in sort of the public policy regulatory debate too. I think there's been a real focus on models and what interventions in models by governments can get us. And we tend to encourage, I think just like Paula's been saying, we tend to encourage governments to actually start with use cases, known harms and risks, and take that risk-based approach. And to do it sector by sector. And so if you start with what are the harms and risks that you want to address and reduce, then you have to start with, okay, what's the context of use? How do those risks arise? How do we incentivize companies to do their part to not allow those risks to arise or to mitigate them, right? And you will find that the answer to that is not at the model level. The model may be involved, but the answer is really at the application level, the deployment level. Again, how is it used? What are the prohibited uses for a product, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a whole sort of product safety type approach to this that's also really, really important that we keep trying to get regulators and policymakers around the world to really appreciate. Because again, if your goal is really to mitigate harm, then you have to start where those harms are happening in the context of it. We just can't solve all problems at the model level.
And maybe just building on that, I know I'm a bit of a broken record on this topic, but when we take that approach, so rewind back a couple of years to when we all got fascinated with generative AI, and I think there was a moment of awe of like, oh wow, we're interacting with this thing. The response feels human. This is so powerful. But when you start to take that, and it is powerful, it's really exciting, but when you start to take that technology and then think about it in specific systems, specific industries, and specific contexts, you find there is already a regulatory framework to build on in each of these domains. There's often infrastructure, there's often sort of people that have been enforcing that for years. There's clear rules of the road and so on. And then the question becomes, okay, once you introduce this new capability, what's the adaptation? And that's a much easier issue, Yeah, but it's easier. It's easier to wrap your head around, right?
Yeah, we often say if it was regulated without AI, it's still regulated with AI, right? And, those of us, we're a developer and a deployer. So, we're sort of at all ends of this. But, we still have to comply with that regulation. Just because we've introduced AI into it doesn't mean that that regulation went away.
Terrific answers. Thank you. Maybe the last question before we come to the audience. Thinking ahead now to APEC, that's one of our goals here at the council. Are there any particular priorities you think we should be bringing to the discussion at APEC? And we'll be back to you before November, of course, but any thoughts right now about kind of the messaging, it's kind of a macro question here, that we should be bringing from the Bay Area to that kind of a forum? Other than everything you've already said.
Well, we haven't talked much about science and how policymakers can actually encourage the use of AI for scientific advances. This is something especially our Google DeepMind CEO feels really passionate about and has done a lot of work to apply AI models to fundamental questions in biology. He calls them root node problems. So a problem that if you crack it, you actually can solve a bunch of other downstream challenges. AI fundamentally is about recognizing patterns, and that's a huge amount of scientific research. It's also a huge amount of the gut work of scientific research. So the ability to accelerate that sort of data analysis is huge for scientists. And so scientists are a major part of the opportunity of AI, and there are policy intersections there. They need infrastructure too. They need access to data. They need compute, right? Again, back to the university system here, right? Universities do a lot of this important work, but they're going to need to partner with governments to make sure they have the resourcing to keep up. So I just think, the more scientists sort of orient themselves around, policymakers orient themselves around sort of scientific advances for AI, the better off we'll be as well.
Yeah, plus one to that, and I think you hear that loud and clear from our university colleagues that they're actively worried and advocating for the resources to make sure that they stay at the cutting edge of this. I'll also say back to, we talked about the risk-based approach and the voice of businesses developing and deploying AI that may not be the largest businesses. I think that's very important. And I also think the point about one thing we haven't gone into as much though is around AI literacy and AI workforce development, right? Which is also a place where I think is, given the pace of change, is going to be super, super key to the continued competitiveness of the Bay Area, but frankly to adoption, to trust, to all of it, right? Is you want people that understand what AI is capable of and what it's not capable of and how they can use it, and they feel confident in experimenting, right? That is a deep priority, or should be, for policymakers. And I think we have a vested interest in that in the Bay Area.
And I think I want to get to the academic research exchange, and in the current environment, there is a lack of clarity, particularly vis-a-vis academic research exchange in China. And there have been restrictions and limitations in both countries on what previously been a fairly free-flowing environment for a variety of reasons, political, security, economic, who cares? But if we could help clarify some joint guidelines on research exchange to help unclog that pipeline, I think that would be beneficial to the entire system.
Rachel.
I was just going to add, we've talked a lot about the unique perspective that is held here in the Bay Area. And I think one of the great things about APEC is that it brings different partners to the table and those different perspectives. But don't forget your friends in the UK and others in this room who want to come along and want to be part of these things as well. So, yeah.
Well, I'm glad that the workforce was mentioned. I was actually in Taipei last October for an APEC workshop on AI workforce development. So it's very much on their screen, and that's a theme we want to definitely continue to develop. And also, I'm glad that Google DeepMind was mentioned. We're going to be coming out in the next 6 or 8 weeks with a report on technology relationships between the Bay Area, Silicon Valley in the UK. And there's a big Google footprint there and a deep connection with Google DeepMind. And we know from that work that there's just some phenomenal applications, especially in health, coming out of DeepMind that are being used by thousands of researchers around the world. So I think we're definitely here contributing a lot to the development of that kind of high quality scientific research. With that, we're going to come around. We have plenty of time for some questions, so we're just going to get into as many as we can. If you just identify yourself and we'll start to roll right there.
My name is Mari Mac McFadden. First, I want to if you give me a little liberty here in space till I get to my question. First, I want to shout out to my former neighbor, Secretary Napolitano, 1200. Yeah, miss you. Come on back. I'm not sure if this was intentional, but I also want to point out that March is Women's History Month. And your incredible panel up there should get a round of applause for their incredible. It hadn't been mentioned or anything, so I was like, are we just gonna keep it low? You know? But I'll take the liberty and acknowledge. My question is, has there been any successful collaborations with the US and other countries in regards to any AI product? If you can share any success stories. I understand that, you know, everything's up in the air, but has there been any successful collaborations?
I mean, first of all, plus 1,000 points for the Women's History Month comment. Thank you very much. I mean, you know, Google DeepMind feels like a pretty excellent international ongoing collaboration. And I think, you know, like just Demis is a phenomenal leader. I know that he really values his personal relationships that he has with leaders in the UK government. And, you know, we draw a huge amount on the talent that's all over the UK. And so I think, you know, just for us inside our own company, that's a great example. But I'm going to like tee up cloud and enterprise businesses as well, because I think that's where you get some of the most exciting use cases around the world between American companies and sort of customers and users abroad. So Paula.
Yeah, it's sort of hard for me to pick just one, just in the sense of you operate as a global company and you're having talent all over the world and working with governments all over the world. It's almost like where has there not been that? But I would also say, again, like heartened by, I mentioned earlier that we recently joined something called Current AI, right? Which was like, the French government took the opportunity to launch it, but it has many governments around the world, it has many nonprofits and philanthropies, and then a handful of companies, including DeepMind and ourselves. And it's that kind of blueprint that we're looking for. And I think there's a lot of it. I think it's tempting at this moment to focus on divergence. And it's important that we focus on, you know, but there is also a lot of common ground, particularly on this topic of public interest AI.
Hi, my name is Alka. I am the founder of Responsible Innovation Project, and I also run RI Labs to help businesses and government leaders think about AI, well, just think about it mindfully. So one of the things, first of all, thank you for the thoughtful discussion so far. One thing that I find interesting for the last 4 or 5 years that we've been talking about innovation, and thank you again for raising the energy issue. It kind of gets, for some reason, forgotten. When we talk about selling AI, innovating AI, we talk about, you know, we let people build whatever. But when we talk about regulation, we suddenly think about fragmentation, common grounds, and the cost of AI does not, why isn't that a design principle included in the design principle and requirement? And how can we change the conversation where it's not innovation versus regulation, but that, you know, it's just cost of doing business. And we include all these other costs. So the environmental costs that AI is creating, the fragmented way that AI is being rolled out doesn't get questioned, except when it comes to innovation. We need a common guideline. Everybody has to agree. Why can't we just have some leaders who show us the way like we've done with AI? How do we change that? What do you think?
Yeah, I'm not, first of all, it's great to see you, Alka. I think I understand what you're asking, but tell me if I'm getting this right from your perspective. The way that I see it, and I think the way that Salesforce sees it and has seen it for a long time, is that these questions, regulation versus innovation, are often posed as if they're at odds. What I can say in the enterprise space is that thoughtful rules unlock adoption, right? And I can tell you this because I talk to customers every day. And every day, the first questions that they have are about, can I trust this? Can I trust the AI? Do I know it's going to give me accurate results? Is it going to say something toxic in front of my customers? How do I know? How can I monitor what's going on? And right? So we know that when we build these controls, it gets deals unlocked, right? So in my world, at least, in the world of enterprise AI, these things work together, and that's how we see it. I don't know if that was the point you were trying to make.
Integrating it into the way we build it. It should be the way we do business. We know that we need seat belts, then we build a car with it. To say, and I come from the tech world, we know that we need seat belts and we know how to build them. So these are features. These are things that, will protect our children and us. I'm just saying that we can all relax. And AI is not AI. I don't know, we keep talking about just AI. AI is only possible because we have sensors, we have cloud, we have other portions of technology. So it's an integrated approach. And I think, you all in leadership position, and many of us here, most rooms were privileged, right, to be in this conversation. So when we say cross collaboration, it's usually us privileged people in the rooms. So I'm just saying that, can we change this conversation at the global stage, especially if you're going to APEC, et cetera? It would be great, if we can figure that out. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that clarification. And I'll just throw in there, from our perspective, no one's going to adopt AI if they can't trust it, to echo Paula. That's always been our perspective across all of our products and offerings, right? Trustworthiness is essential. Like, we have a relationship with our users. It's really important. And the last thing you want is to roll out a product that then gets hung up on an issue that you could have managed in the first place, right? We take this really deliberate approach, especially to our AI products right now, where we release very slowly. We do trusted testing first, right? We do internal testing just to make sure that by the time it touches users, really is a trustworthy system. So yeah, thank you for that question. That's a really great point to raise.
Hi, Romeo Beccarelli, Scientific Attaché to the Italian Consulate. I have a question and a concern. The argument was regulating and standardization. There are few fields that are highly regulated in most countries, like Federal Aviation Authority, Food and Drug Administration, nuclear energy, and these are regulated by public authorities. And the other fields, they are standardized by committees that are sometimes supervised by governments, but not governed by public authorities. Say, for example, the ITU, the standardization of frequency for telecommunications, wireless communications. These are agreed between companies, but there is a very specific reason why the two fields are managed in a different way. In the first case, aviation, drugs, nuclear energy is a matter of life and death. In the other case, it's a matter of a service. So we may run without a service. Then the other fields that are in between, the location of low Earth satellites. Those are under the authority of the governments to decide, because the property is finally of the sovereign states there. Then there are companies that locate their satellites, but they do not decide where. If you have a company that is very powerful, we may name one here that decides to crowd the entire universe with their satellites, this cannot be tolerated. The same thing is we've just matched the case of SpaceX for the satellites for Google. If Google has all the knowledge, they can rule everything else. So that is why it must be regulated for the sake of mankind and for the sake of freedom and also for the sake of life of people. Because in some cases, there is no need of so much intelligence. Let's make a very simple example. The Boeing 737 still runs of Intel 8286, and it still runs. The moment it fell, it was because of a fake information provided to the FAA, and 2 aircrafts crashed and nearly 400 people died. So regulation is fundamentally as long as there is a need to protect life and liberty of people. In the other cases, like what kind of Thai restaurant should I go? I may even Google it and look for it. In the worst case, I would be cheated because Google got some money from that restaurant, or because it was misguided by bad advice from people that had different tastes from mine. But again, that is just a simple case of knowing the output. In other cases, I want to know the explainability of the algorithm. In most other cases, I want the interpretability of the algorithm. So I will not fly on an aircraft that is just run because of the output, because the company designed the output and the software that runs the output with a deep network. Nobody knows, as you mentioned, that we cannot know what happens in the model. If I don't know what happens in the model, I don't want to fly on that aircraft. If I don't know what happens in a nuclear power plant, I don't want to have a nuclear power plant in front of my guardian, or my guard, because I will die sooner or later. I want to know what is inside the system. Sorry.
So I think that was a great argument for sectoral regulation. I mean, the place where the EU AI Act started and part of where it landed, I think, is an incredibly good model for the world. And it's that triangle you all have. Use cases of AI can be sorted into a risk-based framework.
Yeah.
There are some that are such high risk that we are going to prohibit them in the European Union market, right? But that's a very narrow, tippy top of the pyramid, right? Narrow set of use cases. Then just below that, still narrow, but a little wider, right, are high risk uses, which may be allowable, but they're under more scrutiny. And I think that's an important part too, because a lot of the high risk uses for any technology can also be very high benefit, right? So drug discovery you touched on, right? You know, any of us that have been prescribed the wrong drug know that that's, you know, drug matching with a patient, very high risk, but also very high benefit. So again, important to do that risk-based, but also important to do that sectoral-based, right? So again, the EU started in this place where it recognized that the way to mitigate harm, the way to prevent harm, is to really recognize what the context is, how high risk something is, and whether that the balance between the risk and the benefit is worth it, right? That's what we're talking about, yeah. So then the issue is, you know, is that the best place to stay, or should you also layer in intervention in the R&D process and in model development, right? Should you dictate how underlying technology is developed? And I think that's where things got really complicated and really difficult to parse out. You know, I always say about the AI Act, it's just a lot. It's a huge regulation. And so, you know, as we've talked about on the panel today, you know, Google intends to comply with the AI Act. We do a lot of business in Europe, so we're figuring it out with you all. But that's pretty challenging for really small companies with really small legal compliance teams. I think that's just a practical fact. And so the more we can all do to think through what is the streamlined way for us to think through this risk management piece, the more we'll all be able to benefit from AI, but still prevent those harms that we agree we want to prevent too. Because that goes back to the earlier question, you know, if people aren't able to use and deploy AI in trustworthy ways, that's bad for our business. That's like a business fact for us.
And I just want to follow up. the notion that there's going to be one final regulatory answer is illusory. AI is evolving, and the regulatory landscape and regulatory governance will evolve. And actually, from a governance standpoint, this is an area where some innovation on how we do the administrative procedures for rulemaking, et cetera, could use some real innovation to match this new technology.
Can I just say, hard conversation, right? But we all want a good outcome, right? Even if we have differences of opinion. So right in front of you, Secretary.
I also wanted to jump in on the point about model transparency and just say, I mean, I think we would all agree that there's some level of model transparency that is absolutely required. I just want to caution against, and I'm all for it. Like, we're a platform. We partner with we have lots of different models. We let customers bring their own models. The more transparency, the better it is for us, right? So no objection. But increasingly, AI systems are systems of multiple stacks of models interacting with each other. So if we get so focused on particular models and not looking at systems and ways to evaluate system outputs and explainability for system outputs, we won't have the outcomes we're looking for. We won't actually be able to keep these systems accountable. And that's why I keep emphasizing this question of systems, of AI systems.
Hi, my name is Jens Lundström. I'm a Wallenberg Fellow with Nordic Innovation House and associated with Stanford. So thank you, the panel, for your insights on the status on Europe, US, UK regulation and AI efforts. Given the way the world is evolving now, I see there's a opportunity or risk, depending on your mindset, that Russia will reappear here. So what's your comments on their status regarding AI, both from academia, research, or possible regulation areas here?
Slav Ukraine. It's one of the reasons I asked one of the questions, like, is it really so easy in the international environment? You have nation states out there that are have been historically adversaries of the United States, are adversaries of the United States. Bringing them into some kind of cooperative, collaborative regulatory environment where AI is concerned is challenging. And the question is, what is their incentive to be in it? And can we increase those incentives? But right now, and you all probably know more than I do, but I'm unaware of any action by Russia really in the AI regulatory environment.
My name is Michael Beardsley. I run a small investment bank in Oakland called Internet Securities, and we're involved with a number of late-stage AI companies. My question is about standard setting, and how is that evolving? I used to work for Hewlett Packard, and it was a big deal. IEEE, 802.3, CCITT, all these standard setting bodies all over the world. And it seems like the big companies were pretty much monopolizing those standard setting bodies. Are you seeing that today with Microsoft and Google and Salesforce and OpenAI and others, the big monolithic AI companies? How is that evolving? Will that be kind of also favor the smaller guys? That will that be an equitable mix of people? Because to a certain extent, the people that dominate the standard setting bodies in AI will, that'll benefit their companies, basically.
Work on the standards team at Google. I will say that if we were dominating it, we'd have way more standards by now. We really want standards to come out, but they do need to be consensus based. They need to be truly international. We look to the ISO a lot. And the ISO has come out with several AI standards at this point. They introduced 42001, I believe, in 2023, and they had several more come out towards the end of last year. And they have a lot more in the pipeline. That's really healthy, but I don't think anyone, I don't think anyone feels like it's a super speedy process because it's so consent-based. And especially for ISO, IEC, there is, I think, true international contribution to that. But that's, I don't want to get over my skis either. That's not sort of a core part of my job. I just know that for us, we think a standard approach and standards that as many different markets and governments around the world accept is just healthy. And so that's what we want to get to.
Yeah, I would also call out things like the NIST AI risk management framework, which is gives a sort of, when we talk about standards, I think we can talk about standards with a capital S, and then we can also talk about kind of the frameworks that help people start rowing in the same direction. And I feel like there's a lot of that. And when governments take it upon themselves to do that, it's by definition done in a multi-stakeholder way in which all voices are taken into account. And I think that's really positive. I think what I take away from your question is more of like a warning, which is let's make sure that as we continue to develop standards, that it's a big table on a level playing field.
Hi, my name is Anna Jacoby. I'm the founder of Global Adventurous. I help SMBs and NGOs adopt AI. You brought up energy. Yeah, yes. And and so from sustainability, and you talk about risk matrix and everything. And as people in SMBs and NGOs are adopting, being green is very important, but it's very hard to understand how much the inferences is costing, not only in energy, but also in water. And I was wondering if, from a regulation standpoint, yes, trust is important, but also, are you looking at the regulations of climate?
Can I?
Yeah, I don't know.
So just from a UK perspective, one of the things that was really front and center of the Prime Minister's AI Opportunities Action Plan was talking about the building an energy council, bringing together our Department of Science, Innovation and Technology, but also our energy department to address some of these exact challenges. Like, I think we need to be really realistic about the opportunity and how do we manage that. So I think it's an area that we in particular in the UK are really focused on and really recognize. And I think there is more and more debate about that internationally, and it is recognized. So yeah, just to say we hear you loud and clear, and we want that to be a part of our approach, definitely.
I was just gonna also share one of the things that I was so excited about coming out of the Paris summit. Salesforce, along with Cohere and Hugging Face, released an AI energy score, basically a methodology of computing the energy intensity of models. I think we need more of that, like a common way of defining it, because if you can't measure it, it's hard to set regulation around it, right? So I'd encourage you all to check that out.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. I'm Leander Lelouvier from the Swiss consulate. I wanted to go back to something that was said by Ms. Goldman, I think. I wanted to clarify, because perhaps I misunderstood, but I think you mentioned that there was actually perhaps a surprisingly strong through line in the approach to AI regulation from the current and past administrations. And that's very surprising to hear, just from like a public perspective. It seems that the current administration has kind of announced to have a diametrically opposed kind of approach to AI regulation. And there was some very public statements from tech executives at the end of last year about how under Biden, AI was essentially being choked to death, or AI development at least. And so I was wondering if you could speak on that. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I first of all, I think it's early, right? We don't know, as Alice was saying, that there's a listening period right now on AI policy, right, for the current administration. So it's early. We don't actually know what's going to happen. But I guess what I would say is, and what I was trying to say is, go back to the executive orders of the past two administrations, compare them. There's a ton of convergence. Go back to the National AI Office, what it was trying to do, and what it is doing. Like there's a on these themes, workforce development, competitiveness, the question of a risk-based approach, and so on, there's through lines. So I don't know, I can't predict, I'm not part of the administration, but I see a lot of consistency.
Hi, I'm Cole Harry from Imperial College London, San Francisco office. Thanks for speaking to the importance of universities. Imperial opened in San Francisco to work with UCSF, Berkeley, and Stanford and the national labs on a number of projects related to AI in healthcare, energy grid modernization. But in the last few weeks, a lot of those have stalled because of uncertainties with federal funding. So I'm wondering what you think kind of the future of university research and how universities can position themselves in this kind of uncertain funding landscape. Thank you.
Well, I'll dive in there. With the controversy, the withdrawal of federal funding for academic research is serious, fundamental, and a huge mistake. It's really biting off your seed corn, and it's still being worked out. Things have been held up in the courts. But the plain fact of the matter is that research programs at all the universities are not hiring grad students now because they don't know about the funding for them. That means they're shutting down projects. They're not conducting research. Some of them are closing labs. It's ridiculous, but it is the reality. Now, some of this may get straightened out in the courts. Some of this may get straightened out as the congressional process moves along. But what I anticipate, or what I think we should be planning for from a university-based research perspective, is that federal funding will be lower, and in some respects dramatically so. And that means universities are going to have to reconfigure their research programs. And that means that others, the private sector, the philanthropic sector, are going to have to evaluate their partnerships with universities to see if they can help fill that gap. The plain fact of the matter is the US economy is the way it is because of basic research that's been done in our academic institutions and national labs for decades. And the cutback on that funding is a serious long-term consequence. We're going to have to really rethink how we do the research function in America.
Yeah, thank you, Sean. Thank you. This is a great discussion. We mentioned China briefly, APEC. I was at APEC last year, 2 years ago here, last year in Lima, be there South Korea this fall. There definitely seems to be a continuing bifurcation of standards between kind of the Western sphere and China. And DHS has also come out with their own playbook on generative AI. I guess the general question is that what is the role, we kind of touched on this, but what is the role of government? Federal government in the grand sphere, either through International Telecommunications Union in Geneva, some of these bodies that currently exist. I think there's a concern, having been involved in this space myself for 32 years, of constantly reinventing the wheel. And you've got government agencies. So I guess what is the role, and then particularly the modernization of the federal government? What do you see from either through your formal department of DHS? We hear about DOD need to be reformed. What is the role when it comes to standardization in that reform? What is the role of that reform setting the precedent of standardization within Gen AI and AI general in the general sphere?
That's a difficult question to answer now because what we're experiencing in the federal government now is somewhat indiscriminate cutting. without any evaluation about what work people are actually doing, what's the value add of that work, what kind of expertise is needed for that work, and whether it's something the taxpayers should pay for. I think when we get to the end of this Doge experiment, what we're going to see is that some agencies have been gutted, and then there'll be some effort to rebuild them. And the question is, in rebuilding them, can you do it, and should you do it in a different way? I think there is room for reform there. But in the interim period, while we're going through all of this unrest, one of the things we have to keep in mind is that there's a brain drain going on in the federal government as people with skills that have application in the private sector, AI in particular, leave federal government because the traditional bargain that people make when they go into public service is they have a public sensibility. They want to work for the public, but they trade a somewhat lower compensation for somewhat greater job security. That progress, that deal has been cut now. And so where AI is concerned, AI regulation is concerned, AI standard setting is concerned, a basic question we're going to all have to evaluate and ask ourselves is, who is left in the government to do it?
Absolutely not answer it. So I focus on the area of education policy. And so for us, where this goes and coming around the corner from the development of AI into the impact on jobs and the impact on learning and education from the very young all the way through the educational pipeline. And so I was hoping to hear a little bit from you about what you're thinking the implications for work are, because we know there's disruption happening already, where many roles are already disappearing that are being taken by automation and some of these tools, and how we retrain people for work that will exist for humans in this relationship with AI, and how we move quickly to do that and ramp up people for the skills that are necessary today and around the corner is very important to me in the work that I do. And I know that there are a lot of countries represented here today, and I assume this is probably a question for everyone. So if you can answer that.
Yeah, this is another one of those public policy areas that thankfully there's a lot of attention on, but there is an evidence gap as well. In part because we're still early days and we're still getting to the adoption of how will workers use this? How will different enterprises use this? How will it change the way they do business? How will it augment the way they do business? And so there's a lot of really good early research, particularly out of MIT, by economists trying to work this out, trying to figure out how will it affect different sectors? How will it affect different types of workers, right? So I think we've all heard that, in fact, white collar workers may initially be more affected than workers that do sort of more physical jobs, right? But I think as the technology moves forward too, we'll gather more and more evidence. As we learn how people adopt it, we'll gather more and more evidence. I think the key with the labor questions and really with adoption generally is society controls this. We have a vote. We have a choice over how we adopt, whether we adopt, right? I don't know how many of you use a chatbot of some kind on a daily basis or not, but you have made choices about how you integrate that into your own daily life, into your workflows or not. We have an enormous amount of choice. Public policymakers have an enormous amount of choice. So I think as we're gathering more and more evidence, understanding how it will affect workers, the more we're going to be able to make those informed choices. I think, it will certainly be disruptive. It is a major technology. I don't want to sound Pollyanna-ish about that at all. But I also think we should all feel empowered to understand and learn and then make those choices. And in some cases, place those constraints, make decisions as a society. These are places we don't want AI. These are places we do. These are places where AI really helps people do more meaningful work. And so they don't have to do so much administrivia, right? I think that's what we're all going to do together. And we have managed this before in human history many times. You know, the majority of jobs on the labor market today did not exist before 1945. They just weren't job categories. So we can do this.
With that, I think our clock actually has run out, but feel free to stay a while afterward, chat among yourselves. Our speakers will be here for a while. If you didn't get a question in, please find them. But just to wrap it up, I want to thank a really terrific panel for all your thoughtfulness and insights. And thank you especially Secretary Napolitano for your leadership, your continued leadership on these issues. So we're on a road together. I'm thinking we're like all on this train, but there's not one track. We may get there eventually. So we look forward to working with all of you in the weeks and months and maybe the years to come to get to the right place around innovation, ethical responsibility, and global cooperation. So thank you for your thoughtful questions. Thanks very much for coming.